Okay, welcome everyone to this event, Emergencies of Authoritarianism, Global Entanglements. My name is Daniel Leuk. I teach social and political philosophy here at the University of Amsterdam, and I will be the moderator for today. So the topic, I think, of this evening, authoritarianism, it does not need to be argued why this is very timely and an urgent topic. In the Netherlands, I think we know this quite well since the last elections and the name of Wilders and others. But also, just this list of names is well rehearsed. Orban, Meloni, Le Pen, Kekel, Höcke, Modi, Bolsonaro, Milei, and of course the most famous of them all, Donald Trump. And those are often invoked as names for Netanyahu, Erdogan. Yes, we can add more names to the list, and it's quite well rehearsed and often invoked as a sign that authoritarianism has become a global phenomenon. And these tendencies often also share some characteristics like racism and anti-immigration rhetorics, attacks on democratic institutions, what is called anti-genderism, so a desire to restore traditional gender roles and family roles that is often also combined with attacks on trans rights, militarism, the criminalization of dissent, the open affirmation of ecological destruction, and other characteristics that most of these tendencies and phenomena have in common. And it seems clear, therefore, that we can no longer speak of authoritarianism by means of a methodological nationalism. We cannot understand this phenomenon if we just look at one nation alone or one country alone, but that those phenomena seem to be interconnected and that they maybe even have a shared roots or shared social conditions that enable them and let them emerge. And I think from that follows that also the critique and also the struggle against those authoritarian tendencies also need to be international. They cannot really be focused on just one country. But I think this is something that we share. There's also something problematic with just giving a list of names to describe the globality of this phenomenon, as it is often as it often circulates in the media and in public discourse, where you just have these individual names, mostly of men, but also some women. But and this might be misleading for a number of reasons. And this is where the discussion or the conversation today will take its starting point. So the first reason why this list of names might be problematic is because it focuses on individuals, on individual figures, rather than the broader social conditions that enables or gives rise or even necessitates authoritarian tendencies. And this is an insight that critical theory has often started with. And there's this very famous quote by Max Horkheimer who says, if you do not want to talk about capitalism, you should also keep quiet about fascism. So focusing on the enabling conditions or the latency conditions of fascist tendencies. And I think today we can maybe broaden this quote or this analysis and say, if you don't want to talk about colonialism and coloniality, if you don't want to talk about enslavement, about masculinity and heterosexuality, about the border, about religion, about liberal democracy, then you should also be quiet about fascism. And the second thing why just naming a list of names is problematic is that it focuses on what all these different contexts or movements have in common, and thereby one's at risk of losing sight of what they do not have in common, what the differences are and the specific articulations or the specific trajectories and genealogies of those very different movements, because they are also, despite their commonalities, very different in many respects. Some authoritarianisms are anarcho-capitalist and some are protectionist. Some have Christian roots, some have Muslim roots, many are Islamophobic, some have Hindu roots, some stand in the tradition of colonizers, but also some are in the tradition of post-colonial state building. Some articulate a promise of complete destruction. We'll hear about the chainsaw in Argentina as a symbol, but some also promise restoration or conservation. So all of these things are different, and if we just focus on the commonality and glance over these differences, rather than doing that, I think it's important to also stay attentive to the concrete experiences and also the conflictual and sometimes competing nature of the interconnectedness of these different movements. And the third thing why this is problematic, the third point is that just saying all these names, that suggests a rupture with and a radical departure from business as usual. And furthermore, it locates this rupture in the field of electoral politics. So if you elect this guy, then we are closer to regime change. Everything will be very different. But this argument also runs at risk of de-thematizing the continuity between liberal democracy and authoritarian tendencies, and also that fascist or authoritarian tendencies are experienced by different groups in a different way. So the continuity and differentiality is something that we might lose sight of. So let's not forget that it is currently a democratic administration in the US and not a Republican one that is funding a genocidal war in Gaza, and that it is a liberal and not a conservative prime minister in Poland who last week announced a suspension of the right to asylum, that it is under a democratic government that thousands of women disappeared and were murdered in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, and that it was liberal democracies and not authoritarian dictatorships that practice pushbacks, that build camps, that criminalize protests. So all of these elements that we like to reserve for authoritarian or even fascist situations. So, and if we take the concrete experience of many marginalized groups, or especially racialized groups, into account, then we see that their life reality for a very long time were marked by these factors that we want to reserve for authoritarian or fascist regimes. So for these three and many more reasons, speaking of global authoritarianism is more complicated than you might initially think. And this is the starting point of the conversation today. We try to make sense of global authoritarianism, but also question maybe a little bit the idea of globality and try to come up with a more sophisticated or more nuanced, more complicated notion of how these different movements hang together and what we can do to stop them. So this is what we mean with this term entanglement. There's a connection, but not a simple similarity, and also not a simple articulation of one in the other. So I'm very happy to discuss these difficult questions with my four guests and the panelists, and each of them will report a little bit from their own country, their own local context, but also offer pieces of analysis that are informed by their specific, also theoretical perspective that is also sometimes very different. So I'm just going to introduce them to you in an alphabetical fashion. So we start with Debaditya Bhattacharya. He is assistant professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi. and among his many writings are 2 edited books on the situation of higher learning, The University Unthought, Notes for a Future, and The Idea of the University, Histories and Contexts, both published in 2018, and his book, Making Sense of the University, a Manifesto for Our Times, will come out soon with Cambridge University Press. Then we have Gisela Catanzaro. She's a professor of political science and sociology at the University of Buenos Aires and an independent researcher at CONICET. Now it's going to be embarrassing because my Spanish is very bad. Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas. Among many other things, she's also the author of La Nación entre Naturaleza y Historia, and co-authors of Las Aventuras del Marxismo, and the latest book, Espectrología de la Derecha, yes, that came out in 2021, and will come out in English soon as well, right? Then to my left is Zeynep Gambetti, who is an independent researcher in political theory and based in Istanbul in Turkey. And she's also the co-chair of the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs. Zeynep is the co-editor of Rhetorics of Insecurity, Belonging and Violence in the Neoliberal Era, and the Kurdish Issue in Turkey, A Spatial Perspective, and of Vulnerability and Resistance, Politics, Feminism, and Theory. And last but not least, it's Eva van Redeker, who is an independent philosopher and non-fiction writer based in Brandenburg, Germany. And she's the author of multiple books that have been translated also into many different languages. Her latest book just came out in Dutch. Maybe some of you were also at the book presentation on Wednesday, De Vrijheid om te blijven. But she also wrote many other books that also have been translated, such as Praxis and Revolution, 2018, Revolution für das Leben, Revolution for Life in 2020, and most recently, Bleibefreiheit, The Freedom to Stay, which came out last year in German and recently was also published in Dutch. And all 5 of us, this is also interesting to know, are members of a new research project that has the same title as the event today, Emergencies of Emergencies of Authoritarianism. And the idea is to have this strange word, emergencies, to denote 2 different things. One is it has this term emergences, so it really tries to look at the enabling conditions that let authoritarian tendencies emerge in their locally specific trajectories. But it also implies emergency, so a call to action, like it is really a situation that needs an urgent response. And for us, this is really important to not only think about authoritarianism as a theoretical endeavor or as an academic endeavor, but to come up with like forms of intervention or of political perspective, how to combat it. And for that reason, we also, and this is part of this project, want to work together not only with academic actors, but also with civil society actors like NGOs, journalists, unions, culture workers, artists, and so on. And today is our first public event, so we are all very excited to discuss some of these questions with you. The structure of the evening will be that each of the speakers will give us a short statement and tell us a little bit about what is going on, where they're coming from, and also what are useful concepts to analyze these different phenomena. So all 4 of them will speak after each other, and then we'll have a second round here on the podium where we'll try to connect these different perspectives with each other. And at the end, of course, we'll also have a Q&A, and very curious to hear your questions and comments and suggestions also about authoritarianism. And afterwards, you're all invited to a drink here at this bar. Okay, so we're going to start with you, Gisela. Do you want this mic? Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and also Daniel for organizing the panel. I would like to start with 3 quotes. One of them has already been said. The first one belongs to Walter Benjamin, and it says, "The question a critical theory should ask when confronted with a cultural object is not so much how is it positioned towards the relations of production of its time, but rather what does it do in them." The second one belongs to Max Horkheimer. Whoever is not willing to talk about capitalism should also keep quiet about fascism. The third quote comes from Louis Althusser. Marx said that even a child knows that a social formation that does not reproduce the conditions of production at the same time as it produces will not survive even 1 year. These statements remind us that a critical theory should not renounce to ask what's the relation between cultural or political phenomena and the mode of production in which they were born. They also conceive these objects in their productive dimension. According to this perspective, a critique of authoritarian ideologies could neither keep silent about their origin in capitalism, nor limit itself to enumerating the rights, institutions, and lives that authoritarianism destroy. Critique should also attempt to conceptualize what authoritarian orders are capable of producing, mainly at the level of subjectivities necessary for the reproduction of capitalism. I believe the emphasis on the rooted character of authoritarianism is very important today when the anti-systemic appearance of many right-wing movements often generates great disorientation about their inscription in broader social processes. My intention, though, is not to make a general theory of authoritarianism, but only to highlight some of the elements that could help us understand their ideological productivity. What is it that authoritarianism produces, and how do they produce it? What are the mechanisms put into play in the authoritarian political interpellations, and how should we name these movements? I believe that a central feature of contemporary authoritarianisms at the global level is their capacity to produce conservative subjects. Authoritarianisms not only have some of their conditions of possibility in the limits capitalism imposes on democracy, but also generate political and subjective conditions necessary for the reproduction of capitalism today. Among these conditions is central our difficulty to imagine types of relations not structured in terms of the unlimited accumulation of capital, difficulty which authoritarianisms seek to reinforce. In other words, they are oriented to produce presentist subjects. Although leaders like Trump or Bolsonaro sometimes seem anachronistic, their political practice is in truth, actively contemporary, adapted to the times, and they operate by eternalizing the dominant trends of the present. For this very reason, categories such as neo-feudalism or anarcho-capitalism seem problematic to me. Instead of associating authoritarianisms with a pre-capitalistic regression or with a libertarian practice that defies any instituted juridical norm, I believe it would be useful to remember, on the one hand, that slavery and other regimes of servitude are not prior to capitalism, but a constituent part of its process of globalization. And, on the other hand, that it is not possible to speak of anarchy while the principle of property remains beyond any possible questioning and beyond any chance of destitution. Perhaps revanchist anti-democratic neoliberalism could be a possible, more appropriate term to name actual authoritarianisms, but only as long as we do not forget the original anti-democratic character of neoliberalism during the 70s in many parts of the world, and above all, that there is no neoliberalism without capitalism. Now, in addition to this general conservative character of contemporary authoritarianisms, I would also say they share a series of characteristics in terms of the specific way in which they fulfill this reproductive or conservative function. In the first place, I think contemporary authoritarianisms act on what I would call an apocalyptic social sensibility, expressed in the fascination produced today by the figure of the zombie. The zombie no longer represents a simple failure in progress, but a scene of complete death in life where evil cannot be reinscribed in the semantics of what Laurent Berlant called cruel optimism. Unlike the famous image of the sinking of Titanic, the zombie world is a world in which the failure of life is beyond any dialectic, and the prospect of catastrophe produces terror, but also the fascination of an irreversible absolute devoid of all nuances. I believe authoritarianisms operate on this mixture of fascination and terror in the face of a zombie world assumed as fatality. But, as I will try to argue later, if I have the time, they do not do that always in the same way. Another feature of authoritarianism would be... Thank you. Another feature of authoritarianisms I would like to highlight is their anti-intellectualism, understood as a refusal to know, and as an emphatic and even euphoric ignorance. On a synchronic level, I believe that this militant unwillingness to know is expressed in a refusal to take into account the complexity of life, of social life. This makes structural reasons for the subjective malaise unthinkable and allows the projection of isolated elements as responsible for the malaise. On the other hand, on a diachronic level, anti-intellectualism takes place as dehistorization, a mechanism thanks to which processes are replaced by instants and effects are naturalized, as if they were original and unsurmountable data. I would say that while apocalyptic sensibility can be thought of as a false absolutization, anti-intellectualism operates above all as a deification of the fragment and as a fetishism of the immediacy. Last, the third characteristic of authoritarian interpellations I would like to highlight is the exploitation of affects performed by leaders who act as agitators. According to Lowenthal and Guterman, I quote, "Unlike the reformer or the revolutionary leader, the agitator works from within the audience, stirring up what lies dormant there. He does not seek to construct an objective correlate of his audience dissatisfaction. He does not seek to account for the social conditions that are the root of social ills. Instead, his preaching is aimed at producing an aggravation of one's own emotion. I believe that this affective exploitation is characteristic of all contemporary authoritarianisms, and that it is closely related to the other two features I highlighted earlier. Anti-intellectualism as a renunciation to reflect on the processes and relationships involved in the malaise experienced by the subject, and apocalyptic sensibility, where discordances and counter-tendencies immanent to the present are erased. In short, I would say that contemporary authoritarianisms produce conservative subjectivities by naturalizing and simplifying the effects of capitalism, but exploiting anxiety and the feeling of powerlessness experienced by the individuals, and by proposing false forms of subjective re-empowerment that leave intact and even aggravate the social conditions responsible for the malaise. If I have the time later, I would also like to add, though, that this does not necessarily mean authoritarianisms can be criticized by appealing to the same categories, and also that many of these categories should be problematized, beginning with the very idea of conservatism. Putting it in a more concrete term, from a Latin American perspective, where authoritarian experiences often consist of sowing terror and naturalizing insecurity, rather than guaranteeing a relatively predictable order for the national collective, the very idea of conservation as part of the dynamic of authoritarianism cannot but produce a certain perplexity. That should not lead us to avoid the term conservatism altogether, but it does prompt us to modulate it in different terms. And that's what I will try to do it if I have the time in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you. I just hand it right to Zeynep.
Thank you. So I think today one of the problems that we have is a problem of naming as well as understanding. I mean, we've been discussing this in our workshop, the first workshop of our project today. And I believe that the problem of naming is not just a problem of terminology. I do believe that concepts are not descriptive. Each concept actually names or designates a problem space. And that's what we are trying to grapple with. What is our problem space today? What concept names the problem? Not the solution, not the description, but the problem of how to think about what's happening. And the concepts that we bring to this room, audience, as well as those that we discuss among ourselves, are, of course, emerge from our situated experiences. And so I will be speaking from the experience of Turkey, but the place I want us to come, if possible, is to actually go beyond our geographical differences, go beyond the specific genealogies of the violences that we are facing, in order to see the resonances between them, because even though the concept of the globe is also a problematic notion, it is not by coincidence, I believe, that today many of us are trying to name the problem. And that although we should not be thinking in terms of analogies, similarities, etc., we can at least try to connect certain phenomena. The phenomena that I will begin with will be surprisingly neoliberalism, because I know that the way to sort of approach Turkey and the authoritarianism, supposed authoritarianism of Erdogan, traditionally or in the mainstream media, and also in mainstream political science, is through the lens of conservatism. A conservative authoritarianism, of the hardening of political Islam, the line of the sort of nationalistic Islamist synthesis, the Turco-Islamist synthesis, and to look at Erdogan as some form of autocrat in the tradition of the Ottoman Empire, or in the tradition of the traditional portrayal of the East, right, the Oriental despot re-emerging. But I will claim that Erdogan is the most neoliberal actor in Turkish history. He is the leader that has perfected the neoliberal adjustment that was thrust onto the Turkish political scene and Turkish society by the military coup of 1980. This sort of gets overlooked in recent literature, Chile being the paradigmatic example in which neoliberalism set out with an originary violence. We know from the writings of David Harvey, for instance, that Pinochet was not just a dictator in the old military sense, but that he was carrying out a mission together with the Chicago Boys, the most famous of which was Milton Friedman, who had a TV show on in the US promoting neoliberal values. So he was popularizing already the whole set, a bundle of neoliberal values that did not only consist in, as Gisela was saying, an economic program, but a whole program of transformation of subjectivities, of social ties, of the relationship with our bodies, with health, with education, with culture, etc. So it was a great transformation that was being envisaged in the 1970s as a way to offset first the loss of colonial dominion by the global north, and also by the squeezing of the global markets through the OPEC crisis, etc. But that's a very economic story. I don't want to tell an economic story because the way neoliberalism arrived in Turkey was through the military coup, whereby the generals, for the 3 years that they stayed in power, implemented the structural adjustment package that then liberalized trade, sort of thrust Turkey, which was a developing economy, according to the terms of those times, into the world market unprotected. But from 1983 to 2000, the year 2000, neoliberalism could not be implemented fully. That is, there was a full-scale privatization of public enterprises. There was a full-scale financialization of consumption, that is the introduction of credit cards. Actually, credit cards were being sent to people's homes without ever asking whether they had a bank account or not. And I remember when I first received a credit card, I was so afraid of it, I couldn't use it for a year. Yeah, because it would put me in a relation of debt, indebtedness, and I was afraid of being indebted. But from that early 1980s onwards, indebtedness not only became a normal practice. We don't use money anymore, but indebtedness actually became profitable. It is through indebtedness that huge financial gains can be made. Through the non-asset that is a debt, a debt is a liability, but liabilities, and you know, was what created the 2008 financial bubble in the US, meaning they were what were being bought and sold in secondary derivative financial markets. So there is nothing tangible or intangible that cannot be marketized and financialized. And so the story is that in 2000, 2001, Turkey experienced the same financial crisis as Argentina and the Southeast Asian countries. And Erdogan, after that crisis, arrived in power as a sort of savior of the economy and of the nation, of the dignity of the nation, through his promise to fully modernize the Turkish economy, meaning open it up and remove the last barriers to the full implementation of the neoliberal program. Now, that program came with the transformation of subjectivities, as I was saying. In the early 2000s, we as academics were discussing what performance criteria were and how they were liable to change our lives. Now we know what performance criteria are. So basically, what we experienced from Turkey was the precaritization of everything that was previously secure. What we experienced was a destabilization through permanent change, through constant change, and through the are being thrown out into a risk-laden field in which we didn't know how to protect ourselves or how to secure the future. And therefore, I very much agree with Gisella's use of the term presentism. More and more, the future was brought into the present, was shortened into the present, because what you did today would affect how you could afford to live tomorrow. I, as a public employee at a university, had a job that offered me a long-term vision of when to retire, how to retire, and what retirement salary I would get, but no longer the new generation of academics. And so we are talking about a transformation that is not economist or economistic in the narrow sense, but is a social transformation. And what kind of politics did it produce? Well, I do want to anecdotally refer to colleagues and friends that were among the very strong leftist movements in Turkey in the 1970s, and who had to either go on exile or be imprisoned in the 1980 coup. Well, according to them, because they remember better what it was, the previous period, the coup, and then they are living through the AKP years, their remark is that today's AKP is Erdogan's party, for those of you who do not know, but Erdogan years are worse than the years of the military coup. How to understand that? The military coup was a military coup. There was violence. There was thousands of people disappeared, dead, hanged, etc. How could today be worse? It is because we can no longer pinpoint and name one single enemy or locus of power. Your neighbor could denounce you, but not in a fascist way, because you don't write or bring grants to the university so often, right? So denounce you as not competitive enough in the neoliberal field. The field has been structured in ways that are very insidious, that I would describe as flexible but also shifting, and therefore the insecurity that we face is not only an insecurity instigated by the changing phases of political power, but also insecurities related to our ties to former friends, colleagues, etc. So there is a generalized insecurity, which I will finish. I know, like I felt he's looking.
It's my breathing.
He's the authoritarian today, we decided. And this panel, if not, is in this person. But anyway, so first, neoliberalism is one of the concepts that I use to name this problem space. Second concept is fascism, not authoritarianism. Authoritarianism limits, builds walls, is a military dictatorship, encloses, forbids. Neoliberalism opens up, leaves you to run free, doesn't show you any path, but that in itself paradoxically becomes a machine of capture. That paradoxically dispossesses, is the dispossessing mechanism. And in the second round, I hope to give you certain examples from Turkey. So thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you so much. I think a lot of what I want to say has already been preempted by Danielle, Gisela, and Zeynep. So that's already kind of set the ground for what I'm going to say. But I assume that a little bit of a framing reference to the current historical conjuncture in India might just be helpful, right? So I'll just begin with an instance, right? So, and an instance that we are living with right now. On the 12th of October, which is less than a week ago, right? So a very dear friend and colleague in a Delhi University college, right? So who taught in a Delhi University college, who taught English literature in a Delhi University college, died, right? So he was judicially killed, right? So I believe some of you would know of him, right? So he's called Professor G.N. Sai Baba, a 90% disabled, wheelchair-bound professor of English literature who spent 10 years in prison for alleged links to the Communist Party of India, Maoist. And after 10 years of being in prison, right, so the court finally rubbished the charges. And of course, I mean, there's a chronology to it, right? So, and the charges that were framed against him were through the use of a particular law, which is now being used randomly in India to go out and arrest and jail without a trial human rights activists, students, teachers, arts practitioners, journalists, and anybody who speaks up against the government. So this law is called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967, right? So the UAPA, right? So it was under this law that Professor G.N. Sai Baba was charged with being a courier of the Communist Party of India, Maoist, and he was shoved into jail in 2014, in May 2014, right? So in 2017, a lower court in Gadchiroli, right, so which is in Maharashtra, right, so came out with an 827-page judgment sentencing Sai Baba and 5 others to life imprisonment, right? And the charges that were, and the verdict actually went out, and incriminated the five of them, the six of them, for, and I'm quoting from the judgment, for possession of Naxal literature, pamphlets, letters, correspondence, audio, video, electronic materials, which were to be used for inciting the people to create violence to cause public disorder, were to be used, right? And among the incriminating evidence that was again recovered from Sai Baba's residence was something, and again I'm quoting from the judgment, right? So, was something called a red-colored book, right? So that is incriminating evidence, right? And which were to be used to incite people to create public disorder. Now, and for this, he was imprisoned for 10 years. He was finally released. He was finally acquitted by the court, right, by the High Court, by the Bombay High Court in March 2024, and in less than 7 months of his having been acquitted or released, right? So we lost this friend just a week ago, right? So because in these 10 years of his prison life, and that too in a specific cell, which is again a marvel, I mean, of punitive technology, which is called the Anda cell, which basically means solitary confinement, right? So and it's like a torture chamber, an oval-shaped, egg-shaped. Anda means egg, right? So it's an oval-shaped torture chamber, right? So which consigns the pre-convicted accused to solitary confinement, and this was a 90% disabled, wheelchair-bound professor of English literature. So that's the state of affairs in India, and I just want to kind of flag, therefore, from this instance, right? So the way in which the nature of fascism has changed, and which is what we've witnessed in an everyday way in India, where what I see today is a shift from the totalitarian state to the carceral state, and then to what we've been debating all of today, right? So something that I call a custodial state, right? So the shift or the accent on fascism has moved from it being a punitive logic to a preventive logic. Materials that were to be used, right? So a red-colored book that people could read and be incited to violence, right? So it is this kind of a grounding of fascism in prevention, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, right? So which is exactly the code that keeps getting used and slapped, right? So against everybody who stands up against the government. So it is this preventive mode through which contemporary fascism, through which what Zeynep calls, right, so what Gisela called, right, so a neoliberal fascism, that I want to just flag three specific features of. And I think what really characterizes, what really distinguishes this version of neoliberal fascism, right, so could be understood through these three categories of neoliberal experience, right, so, or three categories of experience generated by neoliberal capital and delivered over to technologies of rule that may be called fascist. The first is what I call risk. Right, so a universalization of risk, right? So what we see today, right, so in the preventive fascist state, right, so is a universalization of the contemporary neoliberal, or to frame it in better or more real terms, right, so the platform capitalist condition, right, so of risk as a permanent state of being. Right? So it makes risk into an existential predicament of citizenly being. Right? So the citizen is always already at risk and must therefore pray for security to the state. Right? And that is what I call the will to a certain custodial state. Right? So the willing surrender to the custody of the state. So the state is turned into this protectionist guardian figure, right, which promises the minimization of risk. So to be in the custody of the state, therefore, is to be protected against a permanent exposure to risk, right, which is in itself a neoliberal category. The second feature that I think characterizes neoliberal fascism is is what I call, right, so the operations that it does with knowledge, right, so something that Giselle also pointed out. So since the permanent specter of risk is what the citizen must live against, as the only truth of an unknown and unknowable future, there is a wholesale devaluation of knowledge, right? So risk is where you cannot quite know, right? So to know is to deny risk as the only telos, as the only end. So this is, as Randy Martin calls, the end of expertise, right? This is the end of the knowledge economy, right? So, and therefore, I mean, it is even the end of, let's say, the neoliberal imagination of the knowledge economy. So it is a wholesale delegitimation of knowledge, right? All one can do, therefore, is risk management through bundling of unknown futures, something that we see in derivatives trading, right? Where risk management assumes an act of surrender to the custodial protectionism of the state. If risk is the only truth, there's, as we've said, a large-scale delegitimation of the value of truth itself. When no truth guarantees knowing, risk becomes the ubiquitous condition of being. So knowledge itself becomes a liability, right, that seeks escape from compulsory surrender to custody. And therefore, a red-colored book can become a threat to the state, right? A 90% disabled professor of English literature can become a threat to the state. The final feature that I think characterizes neoliberal fascism, or this moment of neoliberal fascism that we see in India unfolding on an everyday level in India, is what it does to the idea of the future, right? So something, again, that Zeynep spoke about. So if risk is all that belongs to or becomes of the future is something to be scared of. The future becomes the site of fear and not the site of hope, right? So the future must be colonized rather than, and this is how I see, right, so the logic of fascism changing from a punitive to, let's say, preventive mode. So the future must be colonized rather than merely a past being returned to, right? So it's not just a return to a great past, but it is more about colonizing the energies of the future. So contemporary fascism, therefore, consists in colonizing futures as the site of radical horror, right? So the site of risk, by controlling the present and therefore what I call custodializing the state. So all uncontained risks must either be hedged against in the citizens' surrender to custody, or they must be turned into threats in the dissenting minorities' detention, preventive detention, right, so for 10 years. So the future must only ever be hedged against and must therefore be made indebted to the state, right? And the state must become, therefore, almost the bond guarantor and the loan surety of the citizens' exposure to a risky future. So, and this, as I said, right, so becomes the moment of the emergence and the eventual triumph of the state as custody, right? So which is what I think is the moment of today's fascism. Yeah, I'll stop there and we can probably kind of continue.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, wow, so much already on the table. Thank you for having me and thank you for all coming. It's rather daunting to report from my country at the moment, but I try to do it a little bit. I start with so-called or self-declared anti-fascist demonstrations, which we had. It was quite a large turnout in Germany at the beginning of the year, following the so-called revelation by a very good journalist collective that had unveiled the remigration plans that the AfD, so our right-wing populist party, had worked out at a secret meeting that they had in some castle. And it was a bit weird because nothing about that revelation really was a revelation, because they'd said that openly. Is clear that they're like this, subscribing to the right-wing fantasy of the Great Replacement, and that they are also wanting to reverse that. So deport migrants. But somehow this started a momentum of people really saying, okay, this is enough, and organizing large demonstrations. And in one of those demonstrations, I'm going to start disagreeing with them in a second, but at one of those demonstrations, there was something said that I think is a really good summary of the situation we're in. It was a speech by the black feminist and musician Ashan Malonda in Berlin, who said, "Fascism is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And I'll get back to that at the end. Those demonstrations clearly seem to think that fascism wasn't here yet. They thought it was something that happened in the past, but we have dealt with that and understood that it shall never happen again. So we mustn't let this party, this AfD party, kind of be in power, and we need to somehow dissociate ourselves from them by demonstrating. And I mean, it's also great that that happened. It kind of brought the polls down by 1 to 2% of the AfD. And also I want to say that in the east of Germany, those demonstrations were actually really brave and also did some real organic integration of whoever was daring to resist there. But at those demonstrations, of course, many things were left out. So at least at some of them, people wanting to also ask for an end of the genocide in Gaza were told to kind of go away and do their separate thing or shut up altogether. There were some demonstrations that handled that a bit differently, but overall, definitely nowhere was that a central claim. In fact, right now, tonight, we have the first broad civil society organized demonstration for a ceasefire and stop of the arms deliveries in Berlin. So shout out to those who are there. So also, the other thing that a comrade who was at one of those demonstrations in Munich actually told me was that he had brought a cover of the Spiegel, our kind of news, it's even sort of supposedly slightly left-wing, I mean, well, whatever. It's a big news magazine that had a cover already back in the summer of our chancellor being quoted as saying, "We have to deport at large scale." So he had said that in an interview. I mean, I don't know whether he wanted it on the cover, but that was the cover. So this comrade brought this poster and was like, look, that's actually what your current supposedly progressive government is announcing that they want to do. So maybe we should, like, if we're anti-fascist, should maybe be against that as well. Isn't that already subscribing to the great deportation plan too? And he was also told to like leave that aside, and this has nothing to do with what we're here for, and this is kind of splitting and whatever. So it seems that some of the purpose of those demonstrations was more like trying to dissociate oneself kind of in name alone from the politics of that the AfD stands for, rather than having a substantial alternative. And it reminded me or a good symbol for this sort of German attempt of dealing with the threat of emerging neo-fascism or right-wing populism in our country. My image for that has become an observation from another site. So I now take you from the demonstration to a very different place, to a fair in the very depopulated, deserted, depressing Eastern German countryside, where there is this big market where they sell like apples and horses and lots of junk and antiques, and many of the stalls there sell Nazi paraphernalia. So it's a big thing. There's a huge scene, so there are many, many neo-Nazis going there anyway. It's kind of their yearly highlight, and they buy all those ordnance and stuff. Now, it's illegal in Germany to display the swastika. So on those stalls, you have all those military things with this, but on top of the swastika, there is a little blue square that is kind of patched onto it to hide the symbol, because the symbol is illegal, but it's not illegal to like have the actual like paraphernalia and trade the object and sell and buy it, and so it's kind of, I think, just a coincidence that the blue is also the color of the AfD, of the right-wing party, but it's almost as if sort of the AfD, and that's the gesture that the AfD itself does. They're like, we're not the Nazis. Those people who cut our freedom to move in the pandemic are Nazis, or those feminists that want to like tell us how to speak, they're Nazis. We're not the Nazis. So they put this kind of blue square on top of the swastika. And I worry that this is a sort of gesture of disavowal that one could repeat once more by, you know, you could glue another sticker on that and say, so the symbolism for our government at the moment is a traffic light, because that's the colors of those parties, like red, green, yellow. So, you know, you could have the traffic light sticker on top and then again say, oh, it's, you know, it's fine. It's not Nazi. We're deporting. It's not the Nazis deporting. It's the progressive government deporting. So it's not fascism. Why am I telling this? I think it shows that we really need something of the sort of a concept of authoritarianism and fascism. If we want to sort of see what's going on, we can't just rely on deciding that some party is fascist and the others aren't, and then whatever the others do, it can't be authoritarian or fascist because, you know, they don't have that color. And I guess that's what we've been trying to deal with the whole day. And my little sort of suggestion or contribution now for the last minutes that I will still speak is to say that if we want to recognize or understand the emergence of contemporary fascism, I would maybe even also call it neo-fascism, it's important to see how it kind of emerges from, and maybe also creates an emergency of, liberal freedom itself. So it's not the same, but there is a way in which we at the moment witness something that I would describe as a breaking apart, perhaps also a toxic breakdown of liberal freedom into components, I'll say that in a second, at least one of which is a sort of unhinged notion of freedom that is driving fascist and authoritarian mobilization. And that's also one reason why I think it deserves a name of like neo-fascism, or why it's a bit different at present. At least the German 30s and 40s fascism was not very big on freedom. You know, that wasn't their core value. And now, I mean, you have it here with your party is called after freedom, and it's actually like that in several other European countries. And I guess many here, anyway, would also call themselves count themselves amongst the progressive left. I think you've also experienced that we've lost several struggles to people who somehow managed to claim freedom. So in Germany, definitely, that was across, I think that's pretty global. It was a case during the corona pandemic, and also actually the German environmental movement, which, I mean, nothing is as tough as the situation of the Palestine Solidarity movement, but the German climate movement has been criminalized over the last 2 years in a way that is completely unprecedented in our country. Like they've started to go to jail for long sentences and be preemptively held in custody before having done something. But there's a huge popular kind of satisfaction with those government measures, because those bloody protesters are in the way of the freedom of those people who just want to drive their car, you know, and they're against our freedom. They want to forbid us what to eat. They want to change our lifestyle. It's against freedom. So there's something really rotten with freedom. How is it possible? And I also really don't think we should give it up. So we need to somehow work with this problem. And I think what we're seeing is that liberal freedom is sort of breaking in the two components that it's made up by. What are the two components? The kind of liberal freedom that is enshrined in liberal democracies and the constitutions, it consists of one part that says you're an individual, you're a self-owning individual, you can do what you want, what the hell you want even, don't even have to justify it, insofar as it only concerns yourself. So where it's just you, your self-property, your little plot, do what you want. But you have to recognize where the freedom of the other starts. That's the other part. That's the second half. Like, respect the boundaries. And that's actually the language of a lot of progressive movements too, right? We have a kind of progressive self-ownership where we say, no, that's my belly, that's my boundary. But what we see at the moment is that somehow on the left, we often only have this piece of like, oh, more respect. No, we need to redraw the boundaries. No, you need to like, I can never say Verzicht in English. You have to, sacrifice, like you have to affirm that loss, you know, you have to give away, refrain, whatever, abstain, like all those very pleasure-free terms. That's what we kind of come across as saying. And there's not much freedom on that side anymore. And then there's the other side who's like, no, freedom is just, I do what the hell I want. Like, you know, I don't need to, it's my face, so I breathe where I want. Or it's my car, I drive, I do with it whatever I want. And if you're in my way, then you're taking away my freedom, which is like, you're the Nazi, not me. I think that's pretty much, it's like as if we have those two pieces and it's like two shards, and then sort of it repeats itself in many different arenas of public debate that we're kind of getting at each other with those two pieces of the broken apart freedom. And I don't think it's going to get back, like we're not going to fix that ever again. I think it's really, like, you know, we guys, the critical theorists, have spent the last 200 years, or 250 if you start with Hegel, criticizing the liberal notion of freedom. It's like really normal. But I really think right now we see that it's breaking in a way that you don't even need to criticize it much. And also, it's not just a cause for celebration, because the components, or this one component, is really toxic, like it's worse. And I mean, again, in Germany right now, it seems to have taken away like any like recognition of the fundamental value of international law, and like that there are some boundaries to what any state can do. And so it's actually worse to have it break apart in that way. We wanted to overcome it in a different way. But I still think that we should also not be too sad to have it lost, because in a way it never really held together that well anyway. So there has, in the history of liberal modernity, always been some who were not free in that way, who were not allowed to be said that they own themselves. And those who weren't owning themselves, they were not just excluded. They were included, but as a resource, as the thing. So Marx already said it's really depressing, this order where, like, you know, my freedom ends where the freedom of the other starts. We're all isolated from each other. We have to compete. That's all bad enough. But actually, some others aren't barriers that need to be respected. Some others are barriers that can be trampled down. And beyond that is the freedom of someone else. So, for instance, women and their reproductive capacity is something that in patriarchal marriage arrangements could be like breached. That was kind of the part of what it meant to be a free husband, that you owned that as well, that part of the body of your wife. And there was this sort of white supremacist entitlement of disposing over the whereabouts, even the labor, sometimes the personalities, like the very human status of racialized others. And we have, of course, thankfully, overcome that in liberal movements of abolition and emancipation. So officially, everybody does now own themselves and is a proper barrier to the kind of entitlement of the other. I should come to the end. Anyway, and fascism and authoritarianism consist in not accepting this anyway very precarious state, but in sort of reaffirming, often on a higher and more abstract level, that some individuals should be allowed to, you know, own something outside themselves. And this is actually very volatile. It can be all sorts of things. It can also be the mobility with your car, or it can be, and it can also be the fantasy that you decide who lives in your neighborhood and who doesn't. And all those arenas get charged with that promise of ownership, as is the arena of freedom. And then they get like defended with the utmost fervor of self-defense, because like you're the most sacred thing and you can defend yourself if your freedom and property are attacked. So I think that's, maybe the kind of the ground of emergence for authoritarianism and fascism at the moment within the liberal democracies that we inhabit.
Okay, thank you all very much for these insights from your specific context, and also for already bringing certain terminologies to bear, certain analyses to the table. And now in the second round, I want to ask each of you one question that relates your perspective to the rest, basically, so that we can figure out maybe what the differences and similarities are, and maybe also our differences and what we share. So I ask each of you to be more brief in the second round, so that we also have some time at the end for the general discussion. And I want to start with you again, Gisela, because you, I think the most of all four insisted on the fact that the Latin American case is specific, right? That you're saying that we cannot understand what is going on in Argentina, for example, by using the terms that we know, like conservatism or others. I mean, on the one hand, it does seem that all of you agree that fascism has something to do with neoliberalism. I think that seems to be like a common theme. But I think you also would say that the neoliberalism in Argentina is specific and not quite the same as, for example, in Turkey or India or Germany. And so I mentioned this before very briefly. The symbol that really speaks for the form of Argentinian neoliberalism is the chainsaw, right? The Milei using the chainsaw to cut down the state, but also, all the superfluous resources, the welfare and so on, the care. Maybe you can say a little bit more about where you see the differences of the Argentinian case from, some of the other cases.
Okay. Yes, I just wanted to say very shortly, taking this idea of apocalyptic social sensibility, that to me it's a general feeling, particularly after the pandemic, but it doesn't work everywhere the same way. Because, for instance, I think in the north probably, this apocalyptic feeling operates or means encouraging a fantasy of invulnerability in the face of the imminent arrival of the zombies, I would say. The zombies could be the Muslims, the zombies could be whatever. And in other cases, as in my country, in Argentina, it is a matter of naturalizing the state of unshelterlessness, of not having where to go, not having anything left. It's not that you have to protect a property against the coming of the outsiders, but it is more like the apocalypse has already arrived. It's not coming. It's already here, and you have to enjoy the destruction. You have to enjoy the destruction. You have to enjoy that no one will have a roof where to stay. Not like before. Before, some people had rights, no? And some people had some things. And now it's like, Adorno used to talk about a desire of, he said, in the 40s, it was not only that people were afraid of crisis. Some of them wanted crisis. There was a desire of crisis. And for any revolutionary, I would say, you desire crisis. But the point was that in this case it was crisis for itself, not crisis as a state of affair that you could go forward. So I would say that to me the main thing is to distinguish two kinds of authoritarianisms, and in which conservatism works in different ways. I mean, in the first one, effectively, there is an authoritarianism that conserves capitalism, pretending to reinstate both within and between nations a series of social hierarchies and authority structures that have been challenged by social struggles. And in other countries, in other authoritarianisms, guarantee these reproductive conditions of capitalism by naturalizing the state of complete shelterlessness, presenting themselves as absolutely events, as acontecimentalism. Okay, it is not a way of old tradition and all that. They are like messianic. You have never seen them before. This is absolutely new. And of course, it is not new because it is the most common or garden thing. Merchandise, capitalism, it is what everyone has at hand. No? But they show that as if it was a complete novelty. So the case of Argentina, under the current government of Javier Milei, confronts critique with an authoritarianism of the second type. In the political campaign that led him to the presidency in 2023, we do not find a promise of order, but rather the assurance that the disorder would be generalized. He did not offer images of a pure future of harmony, but rather identified freedom with a state of absolutely social shelterlessness. This authoritarianism did not present itself as a restoring force or as of a glorious past, nor promised to protect their own against alleged threats, but rather adopted a pseudo-utopian phase, emphasizing historical discontinuity and the need to produce a radical innovation, which he paradoxically called non-restrained capitalism. So the absolute novelty was a non-restrained capitalism. So faced with this case, this is my problem now, I think a relevant question for a critical theory, but above all for an emancipatory politics, is how to confront a reproductive authoritarianism whose rhetoric selects and offers scapegoats for social malaise, but which at the same time does not promise to preserve or protect anything but property. I do not have the answer to this question, nor do I think that any of us can have it individually or in an exclusively theoretical ground. But I do believe that it would be helpful in the process of collective imagination that is ahead of us, the decision to resist mechanically applying categories such as right-wing populism, where there is no appeal to people, or restorative nationalism to characterize an authoritarian discourse where any pretension to national sovereignty is explicitly renounced. This is not nationalism. This is not restoration. This is okay. So there is no people. So let's not call it populism, please. Okay, yeah, I would say that.
Thank you. Thank you for making this clear. I think this is really super interesting because everybody shares this analysis that it is neoliberalism, but it is a very different form, as you insist. And Zeynep, you also started with this claim that you said it's surprising to find in Turkey not conservatism or like religiously informed conservatism, but neoliberalism, and that is the most important driving force. And I was wondering how you see this in relation to, I mean, the Argentinian case, but also what Deba described. And I think, I mean, it's quite clear that the Turkish case does work differently from this kind of chainsaw capitalism in that it does at least promise some form of order, some form of stability and tradition, or at least superficially. Is it then similar to the Indian case? I mean, this again is maybe quite interesting that if you just look at the religious surface of the two countries, it's very different because on the one hand you have this kind of soft Islamism, and on the other hand you have this Hindu nationalism, which is very anti-Muslim. So on the surface, it seems to be complete opposites, but both of you are arguing that it has similar cause, namely, you know, a form of specific articulation of neoliberal capitalism. Yeah? So I was wondering, like, how you would relate the Turkish case to the other cases.
So thank you, very difficult question, but I think that's going to be on our agenda anyway. That's what, I mean, we all need to say out loud our more speculative or at least, impressionistic thoughts for the time being, and then we can connect and really build upon each other's experience and point of view, and that's what also we would like the audience to do, to connect to us at one point. But in Turkey, the use of religion and of nationalism, I cannot say that it's an instrument, but it is one of the ways in which the distribution of the neoliberal pie is decided upon. And so in that way, in that sense, it is a disavowal of religion in its sacralized or more transcendent sense. So religious belonging, but and also Turkishness becomes one of the distributional mechanisms, the dispositives of distribution, although there are very insidious ways of excluding from that group, in-group. And what you are referring to, Deba, as a sort of the transformation of law into a tactic is also played out in Turkey, whereby legality is hollowed out, because legality is not a transcendental or external reference to politics anymore or to social relations, but becomes embedded in a very, ocean of profit making. And I would use the concept of racketeering, which the Frankfurt School actually started exploring in the 1930s, 40s, but never actually developed. And I don't know if this is played out in the same way in other contexts, but it would be interesting to see. Is that the in-groups and the out-groups are partially designated through religious and nationalistic belonging, but these are never absolutes. That is, there's nothing that shelters any Turk, Sunni Muslim from being chainsawed and dispossessed, because one of the things we need to actually perhaps think about is that such a destructive societal change cannot but encounter limits in, the forms of life that are being decimated, and also the possibility of social reproduction, right? Livelihoods being taken away from people. And the way to actually transgress or push back those limits is to actually provide for some sort of satisfaction or immediate enjoyment to certain groups, right? That enjoyment could be symbolic enjoyment, so the enjoyment through Islam or Turkishness, but it can also be attachment to the party. You were saying state, and I was saying, is it a state anymore? It's a party state, actually. Or it is a sort of patron state that is like a mafiatic leader, the gang leader, right? In which belonging protects one for the time being, because the future is uncertain, and therefore the destruction of all points of certainty cannot become absolute, because it is limited by social reproduction and the need to survive, basically, and our cultural sort of attachments. And therefore one way in which I decentralize the conservative aspect of the Erdogan's government is by saying that religion and conservatism have been hollowed out as well.
Yeah, so maybe this connects well to your point, Deba. So you called the Indian neoliberal fascism a custodial project, right? So, and I think centering on the problem of criminalization, really random or arbitrary risk of being put into custody, like being incarcerated, I think really makes that quite clear why custodial is. And I think you also described I don't want to say beautifully, horribly, how this custodial regime does come also with what Gisela calls shelterlessness for some, right? This like abandonment or this like not caring. And I wanted to know from you, like Eva talked about this power of disposal, yeah, that the project of fascism also comes with this idea that there is not simply an inequality, I'm being protected and you're being left alone, but there is like this relationality, like I have power of disposal over the other, over the, and that this is what maybe causes this dramatic violence that is part of the fascist project. So I wanted to know if you can say something that, do you see this kind of disposability or this project of disposability also in the Indian case, or would you rather describe the relation between custodial and shelterlessness as a simple difference between different groups?
Okay. I mean, it's a bit of a thought experiment, right? So, but yeah, and I will try and think through this, right? So as quickly as I can. So I do think that yes, there is a disposability, right? So there is that sense of being given the power, right? So what Gisela also calls, right? So this false promise of a re-empowerment, right? So where power is to dispose of the other, but this power of disposing of the other applies only as long as you surrender to the state, right? So as long as you consent to being at the disposal of the state. So, and it is a strange kind of, I mean, one can possibly go back to the Sartrean kind of moment of freedom coming with the pain of a knowledge of one's limits, right? So it's a strange existential moment, right? So where, yes, your power to dispose of the other is what is guaranteed to you, but it is only as long as you agree to being disposed of. So it is that kind of a beseeching kind of gesture, right? So that mode of prayer to the state in which you can also, right, so be the disposer of lives, right? So, and that is what I think is the real paradox of the custodial state, right? So, I mean, just to give you an example, because I work with education, right? So, and I work on higher education, as it were, right? So of course, in India, quickly, right? So in India, 2017-18 was when the last employment-unemployment survey report came out from the National Sample Survey Organization, right? So after which, given the findings of which, the government basically banned the survey, right? So that's how we deal with knowledge today, right? So that's what I call the fear of knowledge, right? So what came out in that EUS, the Employment-Unemployment Survey of 2017-18, was something unprecedented, right? So something that has not happened in the 75 years of India's independence, which is that there was an absolute fall in the numbers of people willing to work, willing to join the workforce, to the tune of 6.1 million people actually withdrew from the work market. Never happened in the history, right? So of India, right? Of independent India, right? And of course, alongside it, unemployment figures, right? So rose up to a 45-year high, right? So these were the details that came out. And this is 2017-18. The report comes out in 2019, right? So, and of course, soon after, right? So that is the time when a national education policy is being engineered in India, right? So which finally gets unveiled in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, right? So, and an education policy which then goes out and says that what we therefore need to do with our universities is not create workers anymore, because we do not have people willing to work, but we need to create citizens, right? So, and this entire document, right, so makes an impassioned spiel for liberal education coming from a fascist government, right? And what do we have as the real concrete instance of this liberal education, right? So we have courses like, and I'm naming courses for you here, courses like Art of Being Happy, right? We have courses called Fit India, right? So Swachh Bharat, which basically translates into Clean India. So these are courses named after government schemes, or where happiness becomes national common sense, right? So we have, right? So we, in fact, Delhi University, right? So the country's premier university with some 82 colleges affiliated to it, right? So rolled out a course for 5 chosen women's colleges, right? So on the International Working Women's Day, right? So 8th March 2024, and this course was called Science of Happiness, only for women students, right? So 5 women students, right? So 5 women's colleges, right? So were to be taught Science of Happiness, right? So in collaboration with an NGO, a US-based NGO called Rekhi Foundation for Happiness, who were going to come up and set up centers for excellence in happiness studies in these 5 premier women's colleges. So that is what you have, right? So this is citizenship, right? So recoded, right? So in the times of a falling workforce participation rate, right? So this is how you make citizens, right? So happy citizens, right? So in the times of no work.
Thank you. I think this is like, on the one hand, it's this promise that you described, this like the happy citizen, is quite different from the promise that Gisela describes, this kind of nihilism, or like, I mean, there's no future anyway, so I'm just going to enjoy the destruction or the apocalypse. But you also described earlier this kind of colonization of the future, as you call it. Like the future is only fear, so there's no promise. And I think this is also something that you also talked about, or this is a common denominator, that there is also in many authoritarian projects no idea that the future could be better. There is no promise of a good life that is alive together with others, and so on, and that these are the conditions under which like apocalyptic nihilism flourishes. And you ended, Eva, your intervention with a reflection on the notion of freedom, and I just wanted to invite you to maybe say a little bit more, and also in terms of maybe already starting to formulate political perspectives, like what an alternative could look like. Like, I mean, is it a solution then, not a solution, but is it a first step, a perspective to, as a left or as, you know, a critical social movement, to start offering a different futurity, a different notion of freedom, a different notion of happiness, a different understanding? Like, is this something that, you know, we can do, or will it always just remain empty or hollow or not convincing? Or like, where do you see the perspectives?
I think the problem with the left, definitely in Germany at the moment, is that we're so weak that if we did promise a better future, we would be hated even more, because it would be so kind of cynical, and you're just stirring the kind of wounds of something that you don't have the power. And then there's sort of even more disdain for the impotence of ever making good on those promises. So I think, but I think we do need to counteract this complete, what also Gisela calls presentism, this entrapment in the current moment. And I do think that this liberal notion of freedom is something that gives you an imaginary of, it's only this moment. You look like it's a spatial geometry of where your freedom is, where the freedom of the other is, but there is no next moment. You don't think about how it will go on, and if you don't think that, you can't think that the other might cooperate with you. And I mean, if you might care for you. And if you can't think that, then you can't be, and you don't have a leftist vision. So I think one, like, that's of course very abstractly speaking, but just exiting this completely presentist spatial understanding of freedoms pitted against each other would probably be useful. But I think it's also very hard, because it's a shared sentiment across all political spectrum. Everybody thinks the world's ending, like, no, for different reasons or in different ways. And that profoundly changes also what capitalism is. The performance principle is over. You don't sacrifice now for a return in the present. And I agree with Gisela, then all you can get is like your share in the destruction. That's the best you can, like, just grab now. You're talking about the immediacy of satisfaction. I think it really comes from that vision. So I think that's a very dire prospect for the left, but I think it's important to also stress that, especially if it gets worse, solidarity will be even more urgently needed. Like, we somehow do not think of like this catastrophe as a kind of bang in the future, but be like, no, it's already here. It's here for some much more than for others. So fascism is here, unevenly distributed, but that requires us to like see that cooperation and care is the only option, and also like the ever more complicated regeneration of the ecological foundations of life that we're threatening, right? And I think one thing that I just want to add, it's that there is this loss of the future. That's one thing that's going on, and we are witnessing this frenzy of defending your freedom at a moment where there are real losses. And this frenzy for sort of those phantom arenas forecloses to see them and makes them unsolvable because you can't even address them. But we have neoliberal dispossession you all know what the dimensions, and we have the ongoing like eco-catastrophe. So that I think there is a kind of real context for the sense of loss that our societies are very powerless to address, and then it gets individualized in those manic entitlements in certain arenas that people fixate on and think, this is my, if only I can drive without speed limit on the motorway, which is one of the things in Germany. So that's, yeah. So we need to care for the present if we want to have any future.
Thank you, and thank all four of you. I think we would really like to continue this debate. We do have a few more minutes for questions and comments from you. So it can be just a question to one of our panelists if you want to know more about a specific point or about the country. But it can also be a proposal, suggestion for the anti-fascist struggle that's also urgently needed. So who wants to start? Yes. Of course.
Yeah, sure. How does the more recent Turkish coup compare to the 1981? I was actually living in the country at the time, but on holiday, and then my family left the country. We were living there internationally. So it was a very weird experience as a 16-year-old.
You want to answer? Yeah, I mean, I don't see any other hand. Oh, okay. Let's just connect 3 questions and then answer them. So one was right here. First.
Thanks so much. So I wanted to ask about all this theory of agonism or like friend-enemy politics, because it's not been addressed as much maybe, but I don't know if you share the diagnosis that authoritarianism to establish itself also builds an enemy that is usually but not always a minority, and if you would say that that's something that also connects different authoritarianisms. And if you share the diagnosis, I was also thinking it was also part of the left that kind of adopted this idea of friend-enemy politics as a way to like politicize, depoliticize neoliberalism, so to speak, to try to go for more transformative politics. And do you think that the fact that authoritarianism uses that is a reason to like avoid kind of agonistic politics from the side of the left, or do you and look instead for like more reconciliatory strategies, or do you think reconciliation or trying to sit everybody again in the same table, kind of like Kamala Harris's campaign, for instance, is arguing like, oh, the problem is that now we cannot talk amongst each other anymore. Do you think that that's kind of a solution, or it would be going back to the same old depoliticized neoliberalism? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. I think then in the back was the next one.
I want a bit to expand a bit on the combating of the authoritarianism, and I think Ms. von Redeker came with a good perspective on it. But aren't you afraid that the terminology you're now using, I hear a lot of fascism and I hear a lot of zombie mode and that kind of stuff, will kind of separate you as well from, how do I say it, changing the minds of people that you want to change, and instead will leave you preaching to your own choir, which you already said there are a lot of left progressive people in this room, but that is not the majority right now in the Netherlands and also not the majority in Germany. So that is eventually is not going to be the mechanism that will lead to democratic changes that you envision to combat this. So that's basically my question.
Thank you. And I think, Shaheen, did you have a question? Yeah.
My question is a very quick one. Why do we actually still need to stick to the concept of fascism in order just to actually conceptualize or problematize all these diverging experiences in the 21st century? So I was wondering to what extent this concept of fascism still could be mobilized to problematize or to mobilize any kind of activism. So.
Thank you. And then the second last question is right in the back.
I would like to ask, maybe I just read an interview, interestingly, with 3 people in Eurozine, one of them Anna Younes, and she was complaining that some of her German colleagues did want to talk about authoritarianism, but they refused to talk about anti-colonialism straightforwardly. And they were also a little bit shy still to talk about Palestine. Could you say something about how you think of the, maybe, especially when you were saying, Eva, you were reporting from the German context, could you say something about the naming of the problem in terms of authoritarianism? Zeynep suggested, let's talk about fascism, but what is the politics of this specific approach?
And then one final question was here. Sorry, we don't have enough time to here.
I was going to ask, because you were talking about he was basically apprehended on the presumption of a little red book that could be used to spread communism in a way. Do you think a parallel can be drawn to post-war Eastern Europe states where communism was used as this bulwark against fascism? And if you think this parallel can be drawn, does it concern you based on the volatility actually of how these systems eventually broke down?
Okay, so I'm sorry if I overlooked someone or took you in the wrong sequence, but I'm afraid we have to leave it at that because we don't have enough time, and I wanted to give the panelists the chance to respond at least a little bit to the questions. Who wants to start? In order of appearance, yes.
I think I picked 2 and then...
Yeah.
So to your question at the back, so my analytic vocabulary is definitely not my kind of everyday or campaigning vocabulary. So that's 2 totally different things. But as a philosopher, I want to get my concepts right. And I do think we have something that, I mean, I remember being very hesitant at the beginning to call it fascism, and I'm now convinced that's what it is. So that's why we have to call it like that. But when I talk to neighbors who vote for the AfD, no, I speak differently. But I also think it's a fallacy to even think that you can solve the problem by speaking. You need to have a shared cooperative practice. You need to do something. You need to kind of build something with them, join the firefighters, whatever, and then start talking. And then, like, maybe sometimes there is actually surprising, like, leeway for change in those kind of people who are further away from the academy. Much easier to change the mind than from my former colleague philosophy professors. Like, so I don't think I think there is some hope, but yeah, of course I'm not walking around calling people who are not in power, not holding office, fascist randomly. I mean, that's totally pointless also. I don't want to get my nose punched. Yeah, and then there's the different level of not wanting to get one's nose punched, right? See, I don't know, I didn't get what the fields of those colleagues were. If they weren't from the social sciences and they've just read what the papers write about what anti-colonial approaches are, I understand that they want nothing to do with it. But if they are in a position to know better, then yeah, I mean, the German academy is quite conservative anyway, and now there is this whole campaign of just denouncing all decolonial approaches as allegedly anti-Semitic. And also, I think, because we have so little critical theory, in fact, in the academy, people get very confused and they don't know how to recognize it. I mean, it's sort of easier if you. I mean, we happen to then have, like, all of us studied a lot of Arendt and Adorno, and I'm like, are you joking me? It's not. I mean, or if it is, then maybe sometimes also it is. Then we have to talk about it. But that makes it maybe easier to not get so confused and scared, and that one doesn't. I mean, yeah, there have been some things where it became evident that sort of the government tried to take funding away from some people who had only mildly defended students' right to protest, not even taking sides. So it's not absurd to be afraid of that sort of strategic, like, from an opportunistic point of view. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say.
I think I want to begin with the why call it fascist. I think I don't even want to use the expression neo-fascist. Yeah. I think neoliberal fascism is fitting, but the one objection or one question I would like to ask is how we define or understand fascism. And the classical understanding of fascism is to take Mussolini's programmatic, program as the basis of what fascism promises to do. So we are looking for a military dictatorship, we are looking for mass incarceration, for annihilation, and we are looking for elements of historical fascisms of the 1930s. But I do propose that fascism be the problem space in which we think about a different form of power. A form of power that is different from the power of the nation state, be it tyrannical or authoritarian. Fascism is a form of violence that musters support of populations. So it is not a form of oppression. It is a form of mobilization of populations, of mobilizing consent, actually, of rallying the majority into the murderous programs. And therefore, it is different from dictatorship. It is different from tyranny. And what I see today is a fascism from below also. So it's not just a matter of states, but as a matter of producing the desire for the annihilation of the portion of the population that is phantasmatically portrayed as impeding our enjoyment of the neoliberal cake. Right? And the tactics are not outright oppressive tactics, which is it comes to your question of the difference between the 1980 coup and the 2016 coup. The 1980 coup did not seek to be approved in public opinion. Right? It was the generals. They just arrived with the tanks. Nobody asked anybody anything. Whereas the 2016 failed coup was an internal fight between two very powerful neoliberal/conservative actors in Turkey. One of them was annihilated so that the other could enjoy the full fruits of the spoils. It was played out on a pseudo-legalistic scheme with, actually, now that I think of it, even the idea of freedom and democracy being mobilized to garner support for the liquidation of a part of the public service and a part of corporations in Turkey. Right, so it is a fascist coup. That's why, Veronica Gago, our colleague from Argentina, uses the term neoliberalism from below to actually look at the micro practices that capture people and make them reproduce the neoliberal capitalist system. And I use the expression fascism from below because fascism is not, like I say, a phenomenon of coming from the top towards the bottom, but the fascism in all of us, which is probably to your question, would we then break the bridges between ourselves and the populations that maybe we should be addressing? I don't know, but using the idea that we are all might contain that fascist in us, irrespective of whether we think of ourselves as anti-colonial, anti-fascist, leftist, very environmentally conscious, etc., I think is a question that can build bridges. In a negative way, perhaps, sorry. But it might actually provide for talking points and points of dialogue. Sorry.
Do you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's too late.
Okay, quickly, so I'll just try kind of addressing whatever questions I thought might, whatever I think might have something to be responded to. The first is about constructing an enemy and whether that is something that we could use as a strategy, right? So I think what remains for the left today, right, so at least in the situated contexts that we are in, is for us to also realize that these categories of the friend and the enemy are shifting categories. And it is, for the friend of the state to turn into an enemy of the state, it just needs one speech act, right, so, or probably, right, so one act of arriving at knowledge, right, so perhaps I think, the tenuousness of these categories, right, so is what we have to try and work out a consciousness of, and in the process, right, and which is something that we've been constantly trying to also think through and argue about, right, so what we really need to work out is a politics of alliance, and not just alliance, but also a politics of apprenticeship with distrustful publics, right, so with publics who have been, right, so millennially, right, so who have been for centuries been betrayed and abandoned by liberal democracy, right, so and that trust deficit, right, so is something that we cannot wish away, right, so and therefore, right, so probably instead of trying to tell them, as it were, right, so those distrustful publics, what should be our response, we probably could try and be apprentices to the kind of political imagination that they come with, right, so that is something that we will have to again figure out in our located contexts, right, so the question of the terminology being alienating in itself, right, so the terminology of critique, I think yes, right, so but the thing is, right, so there are different terminologies that we have to straddle at different points, right? So, and which is what we as academics, but also as activists have to constantly try and do, right? So I think it's important, and it is something that we try and do, which is bust the language of policy, bust the language of numbers and statistics.